Our next speaker is a freelance journalist and has written on American foreign policy for publications such as Foreign Policy, The Asian Age, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and Seminar. Meenakshi Ahmed was the London correspondent for NDTV, a popular news channel in India. Meenakshi holds a postgraduate degree from the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, in Development Economy and Public Health. She is based in Washington, D.C. and New York City. Her book, A Matter of Trust, illuminates the India-US relationship that has far-reached implications for the changing global political landscape. Meenakshi Ahmed expertly reveals the personal prejudices and insecurities of leaders and the political imperatives that have so often cast a shadow over the relationship over the years. So excited to have you, Meenakshi. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shubhangini, for having me. And thank you so much to TiE for hosting this conference and for having a literary component to it. I would also like to extend my condolences to so many people in India and to some of the members of TiE whose families have had to suffer through this pandemic. And I wish everyone a speedy recovery. I would like to start out by saying that this book took me 10 years to write, and part of it was because I spent a lot of time in many of the presidential libraries, looking through memoirs, looking through documents, and looking through many of the letters. And I did not want to write a book that was just a dry foreign policy book. When I started to look into the history, I realized that there was a sort of dazzling number of really interesting personalities that had walked through this landscape of the Indo-US relationship. There was Moynihan, and there was Galbraith, and Jackie Kennedy, and Nehru's, and the whole Gandhi family, and they were such interesting people. And of course, all of them had brought their own particular personalities, prejudices to this particular, mixing bowl and to the relationship. In the end, policy is made by people. And so I realized that in order to fully understand, it wasn't enough just to read the policy papers, the histories. You had to also go slightly deeper and read the memoirs and the papers and the letters. So just to give you one tiny example, Nehru had a really disastrous trip to the US when John F. Kennedy was president. And everyone thought that the two leaders would have gotten along because Nehru was a very erudite intellectual person, and he got along with Einstein and Bertrand Russell, and he was a very highly educated man and a man of science and letters. He had written several books. President Kennedy had won a Pulitzer for Profiles of Courage. He himself used to read apparently 1,200 words a minute and could quote from the Greeks and the Romans. And they were a natural fit. JFK was a much younger man, but he had great admiration for Nehru, and he thought that he was the person to lead Asia. So you would think that they would get along. But on this trip, Nehru was incommunicative. Galbraith had taken such care to plan it, and on every topic that Nehru would normally you would think have had lots to say on Vietnam, on Cambodia, he just wouldn't communicate. As I started reading the memoirs and then I dug into some papers that his sister had written, I discovered he was actually suffering, and he may have even had a mild stroke while he was here. And he was suffering from an illness. And it was entirely possible that while he was here, he had had a mini stroke. And so some of these things really may have had an impact on the whole visit, but no one had picked it up, and it was almost criminal that he hadn't been taken to Walter Reed Hospital to have himself checked out, and it had an impact on the whole negotiation and policy. Uh, Fortunately, Jackie Kennedy charmed him, and President Kennedy, um, later on, even though he thought that he didn't get on with Nehru, and he was very disappointed, and he thought, Nehru had espoused it, he sent Jackie Kennedy to India. And when she arrived with, 64 pieces of luggage and reporters and hairdressers. And she just, she apparently changed outfits 22 times, and she took India by storm. And India, which had exported images of poverty and famine, all of a sudden, the Life magazine and all these magazines were sending pictures out of glamorous Jackie Kennedy in front of the Taj Mahal and lots of color and all the beautiful monuments. And it was a whole different, she glamorized India. And it was wonderful public relations. And it was just in time because she arrived in March 1962. And by the fall, the Chinese had invaded, and Nehru desperately needed American help. And simultaneously, Kennedy was dealing with the Bay of Pigs. And so these two democracies, the biggest democracy and the most powerful democracy, were being invaded by the two most important communist countries, Russia and China. And so they helped each other. And it couldn't have come soon enough. But anyway, that was just a small sort of tangential example in my book about how some of these personal things are so important to understand the history. So it needn't be dry. History needn't be dry, and I hope that my book is not. When India became independent, colonialism was fading, and India became independent just when the Cold War was descending across Europe. And the world had pretty much divided into two blocks. The Russians and the Americans had become the two superpowers. And the Americans wanted the rest of the world to make a choice. India, who had just shaken off a Western power, the British, did not want to take on another Western power as its, have to take them on. So they wanted to remain neutral. They wanted to remain independent and chose non-alignment. And this did not sit well with the US. So for the first, I would say the first almost 30 years, 40 years, um, India's policy of non-alignment just did not sit well with the US. And so the relationship had its ups and downs. And I think my book goes through this. Many people who look at the relationship today and see the close alliance, anyone who's over 40 will remember that things weren't always as good as they are today. And the relationship for most of the first, I would say 50 years, was fairly challenging. And my book goes through all the ups and downs of these challenges. During the Nehru times, it had its moments of relief. Certainly when Jackie Kennedy came, things really improved. And when Kennedy airlifted help during the China War, things were on a good trajectory. Unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated and Nehru died shortly afterwards. Nehru got along well with Eisenhower, so that was a moment of relief as well. During the Gandhi years, during Mrs. Gandhi's years, it really hit rock bottom. Many of you may have seen some of the excerpts that have been in the New York Times and all the papers about Nixon's personal prejudices against Mrs. Gandhi. They just couldn't stand to even be in the same room as each other. Um, the Nixon's interest in China just superseded everything, and all his interest in South Asia. He uh, he used Pakistan as a conduit to get to China and the opening to China, and basically, unfortunately, failed to recognize the civil war that was erupting, and the birth of Bangladesh that took place was a result of that civil war. And India was caught up in that, and they blamed Mrs. Gandhi for inciting and helping that. And I think they got that policy largely wrong. Kissinger, who today comes across as very much the diplomat of the century, I think got South Asia wrong as well. And I think at the time, and this is also interesting and something you only learn when you get into the diaries of the people who worked in the White House, like Haldeman, um, that he wasn't exactly this relaxed, wise old man at the time. Kissinger would wind Nixon up when Nixon would rant and rave about India and Mrs. Gandhi rather than calming him down. And he didn't provide the perspective on South Asia that might have helped them have a more balanced view. So I think all these things are quite interesting to look at when you make an assessment of all the available papers. Um, so the people looking at it from all these people's perspective is quite interesting. Um, what changed? What changed everything? Three things. Um, the reforms in the 90s that India took um, basically put India on the path to growth. After the Gandhi dynasty ended, Rajiv had started the reform process, but really after he died and Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee and that crowd took over, they changed and got away from India's socialist policies. And they put India on the path to growth. And India all of a sudden took off and started to emerge as a global economic power. And that got the attention of the world. So that was the first thing. The second thing, and this was a surprise to me, but George Bush II, he emerges as sort of a hero in my book because he was largely responsible for the change in the relationship. Clinton recognized that India was going to be a global player, and Clinton wanted and was very interested in India, and he started to lay the foundations. But Clinton never had the time. He was caught up with the breakup of Europe, and he really it was only right at the end of his presidency that he even made it to India. And it was really George Bush who, right from the beginning, decided when he came in and as president that he was going to make India an ally. And he was the first president who actually came and said, he didn't say, well, we should, this is what the US wants. He actually came and said, what is it going to take for us to become friends and for the two democracies to get along? What does India want? And what India wanted was to be taken seriously as a nuclear power, as a responsible nuclear power. And the book describes India's whole history as a nuclear power, from when they first exploded the bomb to its problems with the US and Tarapur. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this particular arrangement, but it's described in my book. And but really it was putting the power of the White House and the presidency behind it. And many of you in Silicon Valley may have been part of the diaspora, because the diaspora played a very significant role in the passage of the nuclear deal up in Congress. And And that is when the diaspora began to understand their own power in the US. And that was the third leg of what has changed US relations. The first was economic reforms and India becoming a country that the US wanted to have a partnership with because they emerged as a global power. The second was George Bush and the nuclear deal and actually putting India on the map. And the third was the diaspora, which was now becoming a force. And the beginnings of that were the nuclear deal. So these three things really changed the trajectory of the relationship. Um, when you look at the nuclear deal, it's a fascinating time, and I hope my chapter conveys that because it was almost like a thriller. There were so many instances when the whole deal almost went right through the tank, and literally the heads of state had to literally reach down and pull it out and retrieve it because there was so much mistrust. There were so many years of accumulated suspicion. The people just didn't trust each other. There were 50 years where India just didn't trust that the US was going to come through. The Atomic Energy Commission in India did not trust what the US was asking it to do. And the US didn't trust what India wanted. And the US Congress saw no reason why they had to change US law for India. And remember, this was when George Bush, it was 9/11, the Iraq war was not going well, the economy was being impacted, yet he managed to unanimously get the nuclear deal through Congress. This was quite a feat. So he really put his muscle behind this. And just when he managed to get all this passed, and Manmohan Singh took it to the Indian government, the opposition told him they were going to pull the plug on his government. So he had to turn around and tell Bush that I don't think I can see through my government and you have to wait. And George Bush, the whole government in the US was saying, wait for how long? We're running out of time. We're in the last 2 years of our legislative session. And, every few months they'd send a message to New Delhi saying, you've got to move, you've got to move. And Manmohan Singh kept saying, wait, wait, wait. Finally, they were in the last US legislative session. Manmohan Singh said he's got to do something dramatic. And then he went to Sonia Gandhi and said, I'm going to have to resign. I'm going to have to resign if you can't get this through. And so it almost brought it almost brought the Indian government down. So people really, to get this deal through, people really put their careers, their governments on the line, but it got through in the end. It got through in the end. And then it had to be approved by the international atomic committees. And I gather from someone that the US representative in Vienna literally held all the members of the board hostage, kept them in a room and locked the door and wouldn't let them out till they all approved the deal. I mean, literally locked them up till 11 o'clock at night, till Bush and Condi Rice and Manmohan Singh and everyone was able to call up all their various heads of state and get all the approvals organized and ordered and got them all to sign off. So it was quite a saga, but it got done in the end. And now, if you take a look at the patent waiver and what's going on with the pandemic, and you see how active the Indian diaspora has been on the Hill, and you look at the India caucus and the help that they're providing, I think you can see how much power is being generated by the Indians here. And so, the relationship is definitely on very solid ground now. And I think given that the rise of China and the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and I think with China becoming has moved now from being a competitor of the US to being an adversary of the US. I think the Biden administration needs India as part of his partnership to contain China and the Chinese threat. So I think this partnership is here to stay.
Thanks, Meenakshi. Those stories were so interesting. I'm pretty sure your book has gems in it.